Welcome to the Biblioteca Orientalis. In the last years, we noted a new phenomenon among the academy and the architectural studies. Besides the regular presence of Italian professors in the United States and in Europe, surprisingly, we note the presence of several Italian young talents in the faculties of Turkey, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, and the other countries of the Gulf. On one side, this intellectual diaspora might be the mirror of the crisis of the Italian system. On the other, Biblioteca Orientalis believes it's a great opportunity of cultural exchange and enhancement of the architectural research. We decided to dedicate to these scholars a special section of our lectures Unexpected series. Today, we have Luca Orlandi, who's an assistant professor at the Ozieğin University of Istanbul. He will introduce his research on the formation of the Ottoman landscape in Thracia and Balkans in the time of Sinan.
Dear Attilio, dear friends of Biblioteca Orientalis, it's a pleasure to be with you today here. And what I want to present to you, it's my studies and my researches about Sinan, the great architects of the 16th century Ottoman Empire. Well, there are some points that I want to focus on because many things are already said and written, of course, about Sinan as one of the most important architects of all the entire Ottoman era. And nevertheless, I believe that there are still some points that were not so well discussed when it comes not in terms of artistic or architectural values or of its single works, but when it comes to check the work of Sinan in a wide range. And actually, what I did in my studies and what was actually my PhD topic as well, was focusing mainly not just to consider Sinan as one of the greatest architects of the Ottoman Empire, of course, and not just considering, as I mentioned before, an architect who was able to produce an incredible amount of architecture. I mean, a significant number. We're talking about something like 500 projects, more or less, in a range of 50 years of professional life of architect Sinan. But my main point, is related with what I used to define as the sort of Ottoman landscape. What does it mean? It means that, of course, the Ottomans modified through their policy and through the extension of their empire, especially towards west and towards east. They conquered many countries, they conquered many areas, and slowly they modified the urban texture, they renovate the old, for instance, infrastructures. And in years, in centuries, in decades and in centuries, this brought to something that, in my opinion, can be easily defined as a sort of Ottoman landscape. It is very clear when we read, for instance, travelogues of Western travelers that were approaching, especially not by sea, but by land route, the Ottoman Empire, how the landscape was changing, passing, let's say, the borders between Austria and the Balkans and moving towards the capital of the Ottoman Empire, Istanbul. We're talking about, of course, Sinan's period, so 16th century Istanbul, Ottoman Empire. And it's very interesting to see how through these descriptions or sketches, whatever, left by the travelers, we can feel really how they were changing even the topography and how they was changing the urban the environment, approaching slowly the capital of the Ottoman Empire. In making this, the Ottomans were really great to understand that since Istanbul was the capital of their empire, leaving some traces in the territories, in these incredible vast territories that belongs to their empire, was a sign to show, of course, their power to the others, especially to the Western states or to the Western countries. So those descriptions, they are many of the times talking about streets, talking about caravanserais, talking about bridges, talking about many, let's say, architectural thermal baths or some bazaar or whatever, many architectural events that the travelers could, in a way, find on his way to the capital of the Ottoman Empire. And I have to also make some considerations that, of course, those land routes, especially the ones from Istanbul towards west or vice versa, from Western countries towards Istanbul, were mostly used for military purposes, as well as for commercial purpose. But at the same time, we don't have to forget that many encounters were actually cultural encounters between among different civilizations, between, in some cases, countries that were, let's say, always in conflict among them. Think about Republic of Venice and Ottoman Empire. But as I said, at the same time, those land routes were used mostly for trading, for commerce, and also for exchanging, let's say, culture between them. So I found out very interesting that absolutely in the period of Sinan, so we're talking about the years in which he was chief architect of the Ottoman Empire, that goes in a period that goes from 1538 to until his death, 1588, we can see how those territories were incredibly modified. Sinan was the architect, of course, but then there was the patronage. We're talking about sultans and very lit persons like the Grand Viziers, let's say the prime minister of the time, or the entourage of the sultan himself. We shouldn't forget that Sinan worked in his long life, he worked for several sultans, and even with different titles, because for instance, when he started, let's say, as a young janissary, as a military, I mean, in the infantry, of course, in the janissary corps, actually under Selim I, he was basically a soldier, not more than a soldier. And then he specialized, probably getting more and more in contact with structures, possibilities to become sort of engineer working to, in order to provide, I mean, a fast solution, for instance, to cross rivers or to build some temporary fortifications and so on. So in this sense, it's very interesting to notice how all the Ottoman Empire, and actually my researches, I concentrate mostly on the Balkan area, and then zooming even in Thracia, what is today Thracia, that was the ancient Thrace, so was ancient part of the western provinces of the Ottoman Empire. Actually, the incredible amounts of works left by Sinan, or at least supervised by him. I remember when I started my researches and when I was dealing with my PhD, we're talking about 15 years ago, I was very much interested about the Mostar Bridge because it was about to be reconstructed after the civil war that happened, of course, in Yugoslavia and the so-called Balkanization of, of the Yugoslavia and so on. And what was interesting to me was to see how this bridge, even if it was not built directly by Sinan, but actually by one of his pupils, was so representative of this idea of melting pot of population that were in contact through that bridge. That's why during the war in Yugoslavia was one of the first things that was destroyed in order to cut any sort of cultural and enhance in a bad way the ethnicity of the various groups, Christians from one side and Muslims from the other side. But then starting from that point, I realized that Sinan himself and also his, let's say, his office, I mean, his, um, the other architects working for him were very much involved in building incredible amount of infrastructures and in generating new centers from very small buildings. Sometimes it could be along the roads just a simple caravanserai, or it could have been a thermal bath or a imarets, I mean a soup kitchen and a mosque, and some other buildings are next to, like sometimes there were madrasas, sometimes there were some arasta or linear market and so on. So I start to analyze more and more, especially along those land routes, all the architecture built by Sinan. And I found out that in the 16th century, he really modified the landscape. That's why I start to use this word as Ottoman landscape, especially in particular between Istanbul and Edirne, that was the former capital of the Ottoman Empire before the conquest of Constantinople by Sultan Mehmet II. So along that road, mostly of the centers were built, or better, transformed by Sinan. So from maybe abandoned Byzantine small towns, wherever, they reflourished under Sinan, under the supervisor of lit, I mean, persons like Sokollu Mehmet Pasha, that was Grand Vizier under Suleiman the Magnificent in the last period of his life, and after under Selim II, or Rustem Pasha, that was also him an important Grand Vizier during Suleiman's reign. So, and both of them were from Balkans origins, both Rustem Pasha and Sokollu Mehmet Pasha. Though this allowed also me to think that those prime ministers in different periods, but he wants to, in a way, making better and better connection through bridges, roads, and baths, and caravanserai, etc. Exactly, putting more in connection Istanbul with the Western countries. So along the so-called Imperial Road, that was the first branch, let's say, between Istanbul and Edirne, and then, of course, passing through all the capitals of the Balkans, I mean, Belgrade and Zagreb, till reach the border of their empire, I mean, so almost near to Vienna. So the concentration of buildings made by Sinan, and not only buildings, but also infrastructures like bridges and aqueducts and roads and whatever, it's incredibly astonished, because he was able to really enforce incredibly that part of the empire by creating a new, as I said, I mean, the definition that I like to use, I mean, Ottoman landscape, in which was very visible coming from Western countries, walking or maybe on a horse or on a cart, crossing those lands, see the small, I mean, from distance, see the minarets, see the presence of the Ottomans getting more and more clear while getting close to Istanbul. Even I just give a few examples, of course. One is the center of Edirne, that even in the period of Selim II, even though the capital was already Istanbul, was embellished by the great Selimiye Mosque, and that is probably the masterpiece of Sinan the architect. And that represents really the crown of the city. It was visible from very far, and somehow it was like the gates that when you were seeing that mosque, you were approaching the core of the empire. And from Edirne to Istanbul, there are only, let's say, 250 kilometers distance. And so it was a kind of, let's say, a way to show off how the emperors of the Ottomans were present in the territory. And another beautiful example is given by the bridge, Büyükçekmece Bridge, that is just in the outskirts. Today it's inside the big suburbs of Istanbul. But back then it was in the outskirts of the city, outside the city walls, close to a lake. And this bridge also represents one of the engineering masterpieces made by Sinan, and more than 700 meters long on 4 hunchback system of stone bridge, was really described magnificently in many sources by the travelers. Of course, it was used also the other way, in the other direction by the Ottoman Turkish army when they were moving to conquering new lands towards west. But as I said, I mean, look in the description left by the travelers, memoirs and so on, it's really amazing to see how there was an appreciation for how the Ottomans were able to keep under control the territory, their territories, and how the streets were always keeping under maintenance, the bridges as well, and so on. In a famous book by Ivo Andrić, the bridge on the Drina, in Visegrad, actually in Bosnia. Also, it's quite interesting. The bridge actually was made by Sinan for Sokollu Mehmet Pasha, and it's quite interesting to see also in the book that is actually a sort of novel, but based on historical facts, how people was surprised after at the end of the Ottoman Empire, how the local people was surprised that nobody was taking care anymore of the bridge. Because even in the period of wars, conflicts, whatever, the bridge for 500 years was constantly kept and preserved by the Ottomans as an important bridge in the core of the Balkans. So reading also in that book that the people after 1914, after 15, when the Ottoman Empire definitely collapsed and the Turks, they lost completely all the lands, let's say, and they have to rebuild their own nation in a more, not in a more wide area, but in a strict one. And so the fact that the people were kind of surprised to see that nobody was taking care on him anymore of the bridge. It tells a lot how those Ottoman system was working. And what I want to point out, I mean, in conclusion, is exactly how Sinan was able to redefine the landscape through a serial of intervention, very punctual intervention. That's why I also like the definition that once Professor Zeynep Ahunbay gave of him as a site planner. And this matched perfectly with the idea of controlling the territory from architectural point of view, from urban point of view, and also, let's say, from artistic point of view, of course, because the works of Sinan are undoubtedly masterpiece of classical Ottoman architecture.